Silver. I'm the president. And to socialize some more and to eat up the rest of the hors d'oeuvres, which are all over this end of the block. To buy a raffle ticket and to find a chair. I think there should be enough chairs for everybody. I don't see a lot of movement out of the block. That's kind of what I'm waiting for, to see that everybody's coming over here. Drink tickets are still going to be sold way over that way. The bar is there. Admissions here. The literature table for the Tom Hayden campaign is in the prominent place right by the door. If anybody has failed to get literature that they want, or buttons, or other information, or t-shirts, why don't you hold up one of those t-shirts? Super big t-shirts. Great for having a shower in, great for sleeping in, whatever you want. T-shirts are a great trip. Okay. This is a fundraiser for the Golden Gate Democratic Club. It is not a fundraiser for Tom Hayden, nor for Jane Fonda, but they have kindly consented to come and be our guests, and it costs their campaign some money to get them up here. So I have been asked by Joan Clayton to solicit, perhaps more vigorously than is usually done at these things, those small contributions and those large contributions that any of you may wish to make to the Hayden campaign. I have just a couple of announcements very quickly before we get to the main program. The Golden Gate Democratic Club has its next regular meeting on the 16th of March, and all of you who have signed the list in the front, if you're not already regular members, will be getting announcements of that meeting. We earnestly solicit you to come. We'll have an interesting program either on the nuclear initiative or on assassinations, and we are planning a number of very interesting programs in the future. The next meeting of the executive board of the club is on the 2nd of March, for those of you who are members of the board. And for any of you who are not members of the executive board and would like to be, we are accepting volunteers, we are accepting self-nominations, we are accepting nominations of your friends, your enemies, anybody else. Just contact myself or our Honorable Vice President. Where is Mark DeVal? Mark? There's Mark. Okay. It is now my very great pleasure. Where's Tom? Tom?
It was one of the rarest experiences of my life.
He's back there? Yeah. Is he busy or where is he? It's my very, very great pleasure to introduce the primary challenger to our current United States Senator from the southern half of California, to introduce someone who has said yes to the nuclear initiative, to introduce someone who has said yes to most of those concerns that concern most of us. And I hope that you and we will give him the attention and the seriousness that his campaign deserves. Because we live in a time, as we all know, in which the most serious issues that our planet, let alone our country, has ever experienced are being decided, some of them in California today. I give you Tom Hayden.
Right.
Thank you, Carol. I just want to thank you all for coming and clear up one point at the outset. I think that you just were told that John Tunney was elected from the southern half of California. And that may be so because he came from Riverside. He was actually sent out here from Yale Law School and a corporate law firm in New York. And he went to Riverside and then ran for office. And people have the impression that he was elected overwhelmingly from Southern California in 1970. But as a matter of fact, if you look at the election returns for the whole state of California in that primary, you'll find that the more liberal candidate running against the war at that time, George Brown, did not win Northern California. Maybe because he took it for granted, maybe because Northern California was not so liberal as liberals thought, maybe because of a number of factors unknown to us. But George Brown and John Tunney split San Francisco. George Brown beat John Tunney by 1 point in Marin County. George Brown won in Alameda County, and that's all in the Bay Area counties. The rest of them went for John Tunney. So, Northern California elected John Tunney as well as Southern. And I think that in order to reverse the whole pattern and bring about something new, we have to overcome the stereotype that has the state divided in half. We have to reach all parts of the state. We have to realize that things are not so liberal in the north and so conservative in the south as they once might have been. Tonight we're opening our Santa Ana Hayden Senate headquarters in Orange County, so I'll let you know if that statement was true. I'm quite serious. I think that we have to win Northern California and win it solidly, and we have to carry Southern California too. It is the fact of politics in this state that requires that. So I'm going to be in San Francisco and surrounding counties much more in the months ahead than I have been in the past months while we've been trying to build an organization in the southern part of the state where naturally there are more people. I think that the issues are pretty clear. When you have 34,000 people fighting each other on the freeways for 2,000 jobs in Santa Clara County at an amusement park, you know that we need a full employment economy. We had in Los Angeles 500 people get up at dawn to line up around City Hall for one job. They got into fights with each other. The police had to come out and hit a couple people over the head and take them away. That was over one job. The first priority has to be passage of the Hawkins-Humphrey bill, which is a bill that tries to guarantee everybody the right to a job. It's every bit as important as Social Security was to the 1930s. It would provide a kind of job security for the 1970s. Beyond that, we're going to have to take money out of certain wasteful areas such as Pentagon spending and transfer it into areas that are depleted and neglected. I think California should become the capital nationwide of a solar energy industry that would put a lot of aerospace engineers and construction people to work. I think we should drastically improve the housing in our cities. I think that we should expand child care. I think that we should expand health service programs. All of this can only come in one way if we realize that our principal problems are at home and that there's no way that spending money for the Pentagon is going to solve these problems. We have to put money into the home front. And we'll need further money, which can only come, I think, if you take a very stern attitude towards tax justice and you plug the loopholes and you recover the billions of dollars that are lost every year as we support the big corporations on their welfare binge. You agree? It may interest you to know that PG&E here, which is always complaining about the enormous burdens on it, only pays about 1% federal income tax. That's quite a lot in comparison with most utilities. 70 out of 215 privately owned utilities in this country, 70 out of 215 of them last year paid no federal income taxes, not a penny. Not a penny. There are an estimated $50 to $70 billion lost every year in these tax subsidies to the rich that have to be recovered if we're going to invest in this country and improve this country without increasing the tax burden on the average citizen who's already taxed beyond their capacity. This is, I think, the agenda. It is, I think, an agenda that can be achieved if we are able to rally a whole lot of people like yourselves in Democratic clubs across the state. I think it's going to take a grassroots movement. Most people in office get into office sort of the way corporations become incorporated, rather than through a grassroots movement electing them. And therefore, when they're in office, they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. They're not going to go up against the economic privilege groups in this country. If you look at it, for example, think back through history. Tell me if you can think, for example, of a single member of the labor movement who was ever elected to the United States Senate. I'm not sure there ever was one. I've yet to find anybody in labor history who can tell me if there was. I don't think there ever was. In the Senate today, there certainly isn't. There's been one woman in the United States Senate. There's been one black or two. There's been one Spanish-speaking person. Most people who get into the Senate, in other words, are getting into a country club, a very high-level country club, that is not too different from the Mandarin courts in the old feudal days, everybody sitting around the White House. That club has to be desegregated and the public has to be let in. And the only way I know that it can possibly be done, is by getting people like yourselves across the whole state to do something about it. I think that an example of the great problem that we have is in the case of the Nuclear Safeguard Initiative. How many of you here are supporters of the Nuclear Safeguard Initiative? Good. Has this club taken a position on it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, the Safeguard Initiative can be approached from the way that we've heard people speaking of the reliability, the safety, the danger of a plutonium economy, and so on, the enormous cost of it. There's another way that I intend to stress during the campaign, and that is that the nuclear power industry is trying to ram their agenda down the throats of California consumers, and it is only the Nuclear Safeguard Initiative that gives people for the first time the right to have some say over the energy policies of this country. Look at the facts and you'll see what I mean. Who is behind the nuclear power industry? Who's pouring money into the defeat of this initiative? Bechtel Corporation, General Electric, PG&E, Westinghouse, Southern California Gas Company, and let's zero in on one of them, the Bechtel Corporation. Biggest engineering firm in the world, $2 billion in assets, builds the nuclear power plants. Just recently in Sacramento, they applied to build a Rancho Seco No. 2, a second nuclear power plant. It's very interesting. The Utilities District gave Bechtel Corporation $1 million to do the environmental impact study to see if the nuclear power plant that they wanted to build would be safe. That's the level of the conflict of interest that we have. The president of Bechtel Corporation is George Shultz, who came to us from the Nixon administration where he ran the Office of Management and the Budget. In that capacity, he developed the Nixon administration's uranium enrichment program. Now that he's at Bechtel, he's got President Ford to give him $3.5 billion in contracts for that corporation to develop the uranium process which he had engineered while he was back in the government. And if he has any trouble with President Ford, he can always call on Caspar Weinberger, who used to be his assistant in Washington and is now general counsel for the Bechtel Corporation. Or he can call in Bob Hollingsworth, who used to be the head of the Atomic Energy Commission back in Washington during the days that the Atomic Energy Commission let Bechtel come in and learn the secrets of how the government developed atomic fuel. Hollingsworth is now the Director of Management and Manpower Services for the Bechtel Corporation. Or you can call in Peter Flanagan, who was Nixon's special assistant at the White House in charge of relationships with the different federal agencies, including the Atomic Energy Commission. Flanagan is now an investment banker, represents the Bechtel Corporation. This is a kind of Watergate West. And when you realize that these same people are pouring millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, in the years ahead, in the months ahead rather, into the defeat of that initiative, you know that we are on the verge of a tremendous robbery. We are being stampeded worse than the gold rush. And the Safeguard Initiative is the one way to let the people make a decision about nuclear energy rather than having a decision made by the very companies and individuals who are going to profit from it. That's why I'm for the Nuclear Safeguard Initiative. I think that the issue is whether we're going to have a government of the corporations or whether we're going to have a government of, by, and for the people. Every day's news brings a new word of scandals, corruption. There's no way that we can say that it's a marginal or token issue, that it's just a few individuals who've gotten out of line. Now in the last 2 years we've had a president who received $60 million in corporate contributions, driven out of office in a scandal. Then we have the presidents of some of our mightiest corporations, Gulf, Lockheed, Northrop, starting to go under. We have corruption in the highest places in this society. And this corruption extends to the corporate control of the government, to corporate control of foreign policy, to corporate control of our lives. It's a very good thing that this happens to be the bicentennial year, because it gives us at least a symbolic way to start talking about what has happened. Here we are in 1976, and it seems like the corporations run everything. It was only 200 years ago that Thomas Jefferson warned that we should crush the moneyed aristocracy in its birth before it controlled us. That was 200 years ago. That guy was considered to be a radical, Thomas Jefferson. The other people around Thomas Jefferson, like Thomas Paine, they were considered to be pretty radical too. As a matter of fact, before they won the American Revolutionary War, there was a price on their head. There were warrants out for them. They were considered to be extremists, fanatics, belligerents, anti-British of all things, enemies of law and order, enemies of the Constitution, constitutional process. They were called everything and anything. These were the people who made the American Revolution happen. They may have been limited by history in their vision. There certainly are things that were shortcomings in the American Revolution. But the great point to stress here is that that revolution and that Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence and Constitution was not written by bureaucrats. It was not written by a lot of soft people. It was written by people who were willing to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness at whatever expense in terms of their reputation or their life. They were willing to do anything. These were people who gave up, as they said, their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor, if necessary, to secure democracy in this United States. And if you think about that, and then you think of 1976, it's very troubling. The biggest cover-up of the bicentennial seems to be the fact that we had a revolution. That's the one thing nobody mentions. It's as if the bicentennial is nothing but an attempt to get us to buy more junk from corporations. It's as if the spirit of 76 belongs to Union Oil. The only person that's made a reference to the revolution recently is Gerald Ford when he quoted Tom Paine. Fortunately, Tom Paine was dead because his name was used in vain by Gerald Ford, and if Tom Paine had been around, he would have started the Second American Revolution. There's no question about that. Now, a lot of people say that I'm too radical. Is what I'm saying any more radical than what Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine said? Probably a little more moderate. A lot of people say that my qualifications are limited because I've been accused of being a lawbreaker by the Nixon administration. I went to trial and I was arrested a number of times fighting for civil rights and peace in the 1960s. These were the qualifications of the people who created the United States of America. These were the qualifications. They weren't young men who went to fancy British law schools and then graduated and said that they wanted to be in the United States Senate. The first justice of the Supreme Court was a lawyer, yes, but he was also a gun runner from Connecticut to New Jersey on weekends. He would have been considered an awful person, except that his side won. Then he was considered a justice of the Supreme Court. He was considered an honorable person. Considered a founding father, as a matter of fact. That's the history of each and every one of those people. I think that we ought to remember that. I think that that's very important. I think that we have to realize that some new qualifications are needed if we're going to get out of the corruption we find ourselves in. People ought to have been labeled if they're running for office. At least that would prove that they were somewhere in the last 10 or 15 years. If they don't have a label, and they've been in public life for the last 10 or 15 years, the public has a right to know where they were. They certainly were not in the streets. They certainly were not in the middle of controversy. They certainly were not trying to put their principles on the line or their ideals on the line. I think that all around the state and around the country, there is a new generation of people who are willing to seek political office, who have those kind of new qualifications, people who are not running for office on the basis of some promises that they're going to forget after they're elected, but people who are running for office because they can never forget what they've already seen, and they want to do something about it. I see that across the state. Just the other day, in this city, for example, Sheriff Hongisto endorsed me. The press was kind of baffled and bemused. They said, "Are you saying that Tom Hayden is the candidate of law and order?" He said, "Yes." He went on to explain. It was only 7 years ago that I first met Dick Hongisto. He was a police officer going to criminology school. I was facing a Chicago conspiracy trial. We talked, we met, we spent a lot of time together working on common issues. And here 7 years later, the people who tried to put me in jail have gone to jail themselves, and Hongisto's been elected twice sheriff of San Francisco. That's how fast times have changed. So, I think that it's going to be a tough election campaign, but I think that it has to be approached in this context, that what we're talking about is really not just electing an individual. We're talking about whether or not in 1976 we're going to measure up across the country to the toughness that was required in 1776. Those people, you know, they were not fighting for some special favors or judgeship. They were fighting for this country's independence. And we have very nearly lost it in the last generation with people like Nixon and Agnew and Mitchell, with secret unpopular wars like Vietnam, with the CIA running around with a $41,000 liquor bill in certain countries. We have just about lost that freedom and independence that was gained a couple of hundred years ago. And some people say, well, maybe it is lost. You know, maybe we should go back to being a British colony. At least we'd have national health insurance. They have that in England. But if we want more than a little welfare and part of the British Empire, then I think we have to return to the idea that everybody in this country has to realize that our purpose is independence, citizenship, independence of thought, independence of mind. And in the current debate about whether we should have big government or little government, we should say that debate is pure election schlock. That's not the real issue. The real issue is not whether we have big government or little government. What's so great about little government? King George had a little government. You could have a little government so little that it'd be one secretary and her dictator. The real issue is whether or not we can create a government that's democratic, whether we can create a government that's not controlled by the Lockheeds and by the Watergate administration types. That's the real issue. That's the only issue there ever was. That issue has not been resolved to this day. It started with the Bill of Rights, which was a controversial document in its time. We still have the Bill of Rights. If it wasn't for that Bill of Rights, which ensured the right to speak, organize, hold meetings like this, I probably wouldn't be able to run for office. I might very well be in some jail. Nixon might very well be, instead of in China, in his second term in the White House. But instead, times have changed. Now I think what we have to talk about is taking that Bill of Rights and extending it from the rights of organization, speech, and assembly, extending it from the idea of political rights to the idea of an economic Bill of Rights. The right of workers to have some control over their job. The right of consumers to have some rights, some power over prices. The right of neighborhood people or people who live in this city to have some power over downtown interests who live out of town. These are the economic Bill of Rights that ought to be pasted on the door of every big corporation in the United States. And it's going to take a very militant movement for economic justice to make these demands heard. Because it's these big corporations that today are the modern equivalent of the king. They are the modern equivalent. The economic royalists are the IT&T and the Exxons and the Standard Oils. They are beyond the control of the consumer, beyond the control of the labor movement, beyond the control of the elected government. The big multinational corporations have more power than all of us in this room and everybody elected to office. The only way we're going to prevent the future from being stolen from us and our rights being stripped from us is when we get together and organize around our numbers, organize around our issues. The power that we have is in us. It's not that all is lost, but that power has to come out. It's a spiritual power, it's a power of belief, it's a power of conviction, it's a power that has propelled the labor movement at its best, the women's movement, the peace and civil rights movements. Those movements were successful against all odds. They were successful against whatever the establishment had to say, because those movements of the 1960s at their best were full of people who were willing to live and even die for things beyond themselves. It's that kind of movement that we have to create in 1976. Thank you very much.
Very much, Tom. Tom has to leave at 4 o'clock, and I know that a lot of people would also like to hear a few words from his lovely wife. So we're going to take some questions, and I'm going to try to monitor them and keep them short and keep from having speeches from the floor. Who has some questions?
About letting her answer the question.
You have, I'm 10 minutes fast. Okay. You got 15 minutes. No questions?
Yeah.
Question. Reverend Troy.
What, are you supporting anyone for president?
I'd like to support somebody for president. Wouldn't all of us?
Fred Harris.
I think Fred Harris is very good on the economic issues and a very gutsy person. I think a number of the other liberals take relatively good positions. There may be others in the race. What I would like to do is wait for about a month to see what happens in the primaries as they approach the California frontier, and then take a position. I don't think there's much that our campaign can really do. I've said a lot of good things about Fred Harris. I like his economic position, but I'd just like to wait and see what happens. And probably a lot of other people feel the same way.
How about giving corporations some form of tax incentive to hire the unemployed and to train people for jobs that could be open for them?
How about giving big corporations tax incentives to hire the unemployed or put them in training programs?
Or make a law or something?
I'm skeptical of that because I've seen a number of incentive programs ever since I was in Manpower and War on Poverty programs in New Jersey that were designed to encourage the corporations to do just that. But there are problems in it. Corporations don't want to hire the poor. They don't want to hire the minorities. There are other things besides the tax incentive that are involved. And I think it's probably an illusion to believe that by lowering the tax burden on corporations, you'll increase hiring. What probably will happen is that they will use the money to modernize plants or to substitute machines for workers. I think that's just in the nature of the process. I'm open to argument to the contrary, but it's not what I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years of trying that.
Another question?
Either.
Would you be satisfied with the second best defense posture? You also support the present goal posture.
Would I be satisfied with the second best defense posture? What does that mean? We have the capacity to blow up the Soviet Union 34 times. At least on the level of the nuclear power and nuclear overkill, I don't think the concept of number one or number two means anything anymore. I think that we need a military budget that provides us with capacity to defend this country, to support certain alliances, the nature of which may change with generations as people debate in the future, and some left over for international peacekeeping if that's ever necessary. But I think that the defense budget has become a sacred cow. The defense budget is an enormous burden on our economy, It doesn't create as many jobs as would be created if we invested the same money in railroads or mass transit or health care. It's inflationary because you're giving people wages when they're not creating goods and services that they can buy, unless you want to buy a tank in order to protect your neighborhood. The goods and services from defense, in other words, go into arsenals, and they're not used productively in the American economy. And I think that the Congress really bypassed or lost a great opportunity after the Indochina War to review our Cold War commitments, review what led us into alliances like the kind that we had with South Vietnam. I think that the new Congress has got to have more guts to stand up and attack the Pentagon. And I don't see how, we become number two. I think that the important thing is to not even think in those terms. Being number one in a nuclear world sets up the world against you in an arms race anyway, even if the concept has any meaning. I don't want to be number one if it's based on people being afraid of our weapons. I wouldn't mind being number one if it was based on people respecting and appreciating the quality of our life, quality of our health program, for example, quality of our environmental programs.
What about America's...
Down in the front, please.
What about the campaign? Nobody's asked me about the campaign. What is this?
How's your campaign going?
That's Stas Margaronis, who's responsible directly for our campaign in San Francisco. You might want to talk to him after we have to leave. He is definitely interested in how the campaign is going, and the people at these tables, and there's some people back there. Yes, what were you going to ask?
I'm just curious, in line with your question about defense, how do you see aid to Israel in terms of ongoing American policy?
I think that we should maintain a level of military and economic assistance to Israel sufficient to protect their existence. I think beyond that, we should not be involved in what appears to be an unfolding arms race between various countries there, in which our aerospace industry is the supplier of weapons and our Secretary of State is the umpire. I don't think that arms races lead to peace. I think they lead to higher and higher levels of tension, stalemate that finally breaks into a war. I would like to see a negotiated settlement in which the Arab parties recognize the existence of Israel, and in return Israel negotiates with the Palestinians and the other Arab countries. The United States should try to be a party to that settlement if American military commitments or diplomatic commitments help guarantee the settlement, so be it. I think that may be 20 years away or 10. When I talk to Israelis or talk to Arab students in this country, I find very little prospect in anybody's mind for a settlement of that kind, at least during the election year. Maybe 1977, some steps. Yes?
Do you think that the Hawkins and Humphrey full employment bills have much chance of passing?
Do the Hawkins-Humphrey full employment bills have much chance of passing? I have been talking about them since June, when I announced, and I have noticed that more and more people are talking about them, and that's the only way I can see it passing. Most of the presidential candidates have endorsed the concept or endorsed the legislation, Democratic presidential candidates. That means to me that if the Democrats elect the president and the Congress, there's a very good chance that it will pass in the next session. I noticed the other day, I don't know if it was in the Chronicle or where, but I noticed there was a front page story saying that there are negotiations going on between the labor movement, minorities, and others in the Democratic Party to make some version of the Hawkins-Humphrey bill the focal point of the National Democratic Economic Platform. So that's a big change over 7 or 8 months. So yeah, I have to say, looking back to June, that there's been an improvement. There's been an increasing acceptance of the idea. Now, did you want Jane to speak? Because I think we're going to have to leave real soon. So well, she can answer questions better than me. Just bring her up. Where is she? nice to see you. There you go.
What would you like me to do? Answer your questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Speech.
Okay. I'm tempted to ask a question around Benny Ford. I love you more than her.
Is it an either or?
No. The question I was wondering what Tom's position is, and yours, on the Absent Amendment to the Civil Rights Act of '64 to extend the protection of civil rights to gay people.
Is that to me?
Either or both.
I'm in favor
I
of
presume you
making the
agree
bill.
with the board.
We support the idea that gay people should not be discriminated against, harassed by law enforcement officials, or in any kind of way.
What about the Absent Amendment?
I'm not familiar with it.
Are you asking about the Bell Absent bill in the House?
Yes.
Yes, I'm committed to introducing it in the Senate.
Great.
Am I allowed to say where I met you last? I met you in Venice when you did a marvelous film at the International Film Festival. I'm overjoyed to see you. The point is, I want to know one thing you're going to do for senior citizens. Not just women, but senior citizens.
The question is, what is he going to do for senior citizens? Well, just generally, one thing that speaks very directly to senior citizens is the question of the Kennedy-Corman health insurance bill, which we support, which Tunney does not support. To say that health insurance is too inflationary at this period of our history is, we think, to be grossly out of touch with the people, the poor people, senior citizens, people who are suffering so much because they can't afford proper medical care.
That's the question.
Any other questions for Jane Fonda?
Yes, right
Yes,
here.
over here.
I'd like to know, I'd like you to point out specifically, Tom must be running for a reason, but he must object to or have some conflict with Tunney. And I'd like to know some of the points that he feels that Tunney is not doing for us, that he's going to do for us, if he's elected.
Write a book about the things that Tunney is not doing for you. We say that we're running for a vacancy in the Senate created by John Tunney. What is Tunney doing for us in California?
Well, what does any
especially for
politician
poor and
do?
working people? Perhaps politicians, the way you probably think of them when you say the word, can't do very much. I think it's too late for politicians. We need leaders, we need organizers, we need Jeremiahs. We need people who've spent their entire adult lives in the streets, in the prisons, in the courtrooms, in the ghettos, in the barrios, fighting for people when it wasn't fashionable. That's what Tom Hayden has done. Tom Hayden says that if Tunney says that it's too inflationary to provide our people with health care, then our priorities are asked backwards. Why is it that Tunney, for example, refuses to support national health care but supports the B-1 bomber, supports an inflated military budget? Not even because it might provide jobs, which it won't necessarily, but because, I think his quote is, in case our skies are ever darkened again by war. In other words, he is coming from a Cold War place. He believes that the main threat to this country is coming from outside, not from the collapse internally. We believe that what's inflationary is a bloated military budget, not health care. We believe that the deregulation of natural gas, which Tunney supports, should be fought tooth and nail, because it will mean billions of dollars taken from American taxpayers, the people of California's pockets, for example, and will go to the big oil companies. These are two examples. Fighting against entrenched bureaucracy. It was Tom who was the first organizer into the ghettos of Newark, who organized poor people around the questions of housing and tenants' rights, who first exposed the corruption of the Adonisio administration. Adonisio is still in jail. Tom was one of the first people to go south in the civil rights movement, a movement which eventually broke the back of the Dixiecrats and brought 1,000 black people into political office. Tom was the first American, one of the first Americans to go to Indochina when it was certainly not fashionable, negotiated with the Indochinese government and with the State Department, with Abe O'Harriman, for the first release of the American POWs. Tom has been qualified as an expert witness opposite the State Department witness on the negotiations volumes of the Pentagon Papers at the Pentagon Paper trial. He's taught classes in the House of Representatives to members of Congress and their staff. I could go on, but the point is he's done more out of office than most politicians have done after a lifetime of being in office.
Right.
And it's always been for public interest. It's been